So I thought I'd make a quick little video that's a bit more casual in nature to describe, as far as I can see it, the nature of the meta crisis. And so I threw together a little visual like this because A, B, and C and D really kind of represent different kind of crises that different people are applying themselves to remedying. This is like conflict. Maybe it's the Gaza Strip, just back and forth between conflict. Maybe it's Russia and Ukraine. That's part and parcel for the nature of civilization that's been going on for quite a while. But if it's continued unchecked, it could become existential. This one is kind of embedded growth obligations, this quarterly profits at any cost that is quite unsustainable. You can't have infinite growth on a finite biosphere, and transforming the whole natural world into profit is going to bite in the ass eventually. So the C is basically any civilization that's kind of inexorably using the resources to such an extent that they're destroying the biosphere they just depend upon. And so that's C. It's pretty understandable. D is like propaganda, embedded growth, no, like manufactured demand, manipulation, social media, just manipulating the populace for their own ends in a way that's not in the best interest of people, you know? And so all of these have different civic efforts that are applying themselves to them, whether it's conflict or climate change or better growth obligations. You've got corporate reform, educational reform, environmental initiatives, political action groups. They're all doing great work. They really are. They're, comparatively speaking, some of the best people. But if you ask yourself, well, why in 30, 40, 50 fucking years of civic work have we not even plateaued these problems? From a metric standpoint, every single fucking problem. Maybe they're not as bad as they otherwise would have been, but they're still exponential. They're not plateauing, and they're not even remotely gotten ahead of. That's probably because we're not dealing with them upstream enough. We're dealing with them downstream at the symptoms, not the cause. And so if you think of them as generator functions or generative dynamics that are behind a lot of these existential crises, that's the meta crisis. All these societal problems have a shared root structure that kind of informs them, that kind of is the root structure of why they are as bad as that they are, and they're very similar in their root structure to the rest of the other societal crises. And so you've got to go that far upstream to the root cause of a lot of these problems. And my wording for that is inadequate societal sense making. It's people's relationship to reality, which is why we see ourselves as rivalrously in competition with others for some scarce resource, and we just got to destroy them at all costs. That's always the MO. Or it's profit at all cost, kind of like a cancer cell. Like that's not really in conducive relationship with your ecosystem. Or, destroying your ecosystem for profit at the expense of the biosphere you depend upon. Or manipulating people in a way that is not in their best interest. You wouldn't be doing that to a family member. Why are you doing that to other people? It's this fragmentation of consciousness of I can benefit my own well-being at the expense or even just independent of someone else's well-being. It's not taking the whole into account. As soon as you prioritize you and yours at the expense of others people, that causes externalities that will eventually come full circle and affect you. It's not smart calculus, regardless of whether it's ethical or not. It's not intelligent on a long enough time frame. There might be rational self-interest involved, but it's not actually rational if you think on a long enough time scale. And so whether it's Simon Sinek's infinite game or any of these longer term kind of methodologies that people are trying to implore and facilitate in other people, that's kind of the MO. But a broader picture that I like to use is if you think of our societal sense making, what informs our societal actions, in relationship to others, that's like a tended to garden. And in the same way that a tended to garden, you can either just water the fucking plants or you can just spend all your time pulling out weeds and rot. We've been spending all our time pulling out weeds and rot. And that's basically policing efforts, prison efforts, military, rule of law, anything that's a deterrent falls into that camp. And then watering the fucking plants is just education, stewardship, diplomacy, trying to foster a better sense making in our society. And that's always got cut because there's not an easy understood profit model behind that. The payoffs don't pay off for decades in terms of just stewarding a better understanding of your reality. And so that's why we're always putting our eggs on the other basket. And you probably get 10 times return on just watering the fucking plants. But we've been cutting that every which way. And right, if you just water the fucking plants, there's fewer weeds you're going to even have to pull out. And so all of these negative dynamics, whether they're embedded growth obligations, perverse incentives, all the different negative phenomena that you see, they're kind of a natural result of an untended to garden. When you're not watering the fucking plants, you get rot and infestation and weeds and all kinds of things that are like these perverse incentives. And just in the same way that MBA programs and political science degrees used to require an ethics course to graduate, and now it's an elective, and a lot of times people just don't even take that course, in places where it went from a required course to an elective, literally within a few years, you saw a higher rate of corporate malfeasance and negligence and fraud in those places where they didn't even take the ethics course at all. And so if you're not teaching it, how can you expect them to operate that way? And because it's not being prioritized, people are operating in a very unconducive way with their reality, whether it's with other people or with their environment. And so if we have any seriousness to address these problems upstream at the root, we have to figure out better ways of stewarding our societal sense making, whether that comes through educational reform or diplomacy or vectoring the logic forward within our political economies or materials economies, finding the wins where you can through ranked choice voting or B Corps, or fostering better harmonious relationships between different sides of the political aisle, or depleting conflict and polarization, or affecting the culture, the public consciousness through social media efforts. All of that plays a role in stewarding our societal sense making upstream as you can, and hopefully in a much more coordinated way with other individuals, so we're pulling our resources and collaborating with other efforts that are doing that kind of culture work to steward our societal sense making. That's how, if there's any conceivable way to get ahead of these problems in the next 20, 30 years before they become existential, that's what we've got to do. We've got to be pooling our resources, redirecting funding into efforts that are stewarding our societal sense making as deep into the root structures as we can. Maybe that's our media institutions. Maybe that's educational reform. Maybe that's media conglomerates, you know? All of that is playing a very vital role, and that's how far upstream you really have to think. Because it's the same phenomenon that we've always been dealing with, really. This goes as far back as the agricultural revolution of the animistic cultures that were outcompeted by the cultures that had developed the plow. Those cultures that developed the plow, strapping a plow to a cow, they have to rationalize a more erroneous relationship to reality of, oh, I can justify this because I can subjugate the reality to my will, right? They start to change their language. And it's kind of a chicken or an egg thing, which one came first. But however you skin it, as they develop now this game theoretic advantage over the animistic cultures at the expense of a more unethical, erroneous relationship to reality, that's the problem. And it's really the natural result of an untended to sense making. If you tend to societal sense making, in the same way that people will say, well, the only way to stop the logging of a national park is through deterrence and rule of law. I'm sorry, but that's not the only way that you prevent people from logging the national park with, deterrence. You can prevent that by just stewarding sense making so that people don't see the benefit and it's not worth the trade-off to them to log those trees. I mean, you have to ask yourself, those that have the ability to log those trees or take the oil, whatever it is, and they don't, why not? You're not doing that. I'm not doing that. Daniel Schmachtenberger's not doing that. Why? Because we don't see the gain to be had. You can even think about that on smaller scales when you play a Monopoly game. If you're not willing to be an asshole to win that game of Monopoly, you're an example of somebody that sees the trade-offs of being an asshole and decides not to do it, because it's not actually a very fulfilling calculus to run when you really think about it. Those that are winning in this game A, like profit at all costs, it's not a very enviable mindset, really. It's filled with pathologies and it's fairly miserable, and even the animistic cultures, by every metric, were a bit more fulfilled than those that had started developing these game theoretic technological advancements. And so my favorite analogy of that is just Groundhog Day with Bill Murray. Bill Murray is a total asshole, selfish individual at the beginning of the movie, but he starts repeating that day endlessly, and he's stuck in an infinite existence, if you can think of it. And he just finds that irregardless of what is gaining or losing, stealing from a bank or being an asshole, it's not very fulfilling. It's just not satiating. And he starts to become what you could call a very more omnipositive relationship to his community. He's very beneficial, and he's enjoying himself. It's actually very fulfilling. And so I say that given a long enough time scale, the operative protocol becomes to just get good at existing. And to get good at existing has some good objective answers, like stewarding your own sense-making and the sense-making of other people, being an omnipositive part and role player within your civilization so you're maximizing the well-being of everybody, which includes yourself. That's getting good at existing. It's far more fulfilling calculus to run, irregardless of the end outcome. And as we facilitate that in more people, that's how you start to get ahead of this, is just showing them that this smart man in the room or apex predator calculus doesn't even make a whole lot of fucking sense, and it's not exactly very fulfilling. And as people start to transition into a more omnipositive relationship to reality, that's how we shift the needle. And so I just saw this movie Wildlife about Patagonia and the founder of Patagonia and how he moved to Chile and started creating national parks. That's an example of somebody that was winning in the corporate landscape and wasn't very fulfilled and started shifting his calculus to just saving the environment in Chile and Argentina. There's examples of this, okay? isolated examples that you can start to perpetuate outward and propagate and cross-pollinate as far as you can, and finding the wins where you can, finding the momentum where you can. You can find eco-villages and intentional living communities that are living more harmoniously with their reality. How can you ripple that outward? How can you understand how they arrived at that calculus? Because it didn't happen in a vacuum. None of us that are operating a bit more ethically came out the womb that way. What did we see that got us to start to recognize the better viability of operating conducively with our environment? And those that aren't, why aren't they? And what would they have to see to shift their calculus to see a better viability to being a better steward of their environment? Because guess what? There's frames of reference for that. You can find examples of it, and you can start to foster the conditions for others to recognize that calculus for themselves. That's going upstream and dealing with this at the root. And that's how you get ahead of this, is coordinating with others that are doing that, operating collaboratively, and beginning to shift the needle ever so slightly as you can, hopefully enough within the allowable time frame, by metrics, by goalposts, to shift our societal sense making to such an extent that we're operating more conducively with our ecosystem. If we can do that, a lot of these existential problems will begin to become less pronounced. They'll never go away overnight. There's no problem or solution that doesn't have risk involved. There's always going to be risk involved, but you can torque it down as best you can by just torquing up your sense making and better understanding the phenomenon. It's like windsurfing. You're not going to get ahead of becoming a good windsurfer by just reading a lot of textbooks. You have to understand all the phenomena involved, from the wind speeds and the currents and the physics involved, and you have to get out into it, and you have to develop a very rich intuitive understanding for those phenomenon to be a good windsurfer. Similar with this, you got to understand those dynamics without judging them too harshly. You have to just understand this human phenomenon and see it at play in the larger scales as well as the smaller scales, because these perverse incentives can be seen everywhere, and they only play out so many ways. You can start to understand the conditions that are necessary to make them play out in a positive way. So there you have it. That's the best I've got. Hope you like it. And I don't know, reach out and do a Zoom call and chat about it if you like. Thanks.